Hi everyone, who really composed the Iliad and the Odyssey? So according to tradition, and this tradition goes back a very long way, these were composed by Homer. Homer was, of course, the famous blind poet, the most famous poet of Greek history. However, according to some modern scholars, he wasn't actually the real author or composer of these poems. Some scholars say that he never existed at all, others say that maybe he did exist, but he wasn't the composer of these poems. Some scholars have argued that they can identify, likely, the specific person who did compose these poems, and it wasn't Homer. So, what's the evidence for that, and does it stand up to scrutiny? Well, first of all, we need to examine why should we even entertain the idea that they were composed by Homer? Where does this come from? How far back does this go? Well, this tradition goes back a very long way. So, for example, in the writings of Herodotus, we see that Herodotus refers to the Iliad various times. He quotes from it, he discusses passages in it, and he attributes these passages without qualification to Homer. He doesn't suggest any kind of ambiguity or doubt about who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. To him, it is just completely certain it was Homer. That is just a fact. But the attribution of these poems to Homer dates back further than just Herodotus. We can date it back to at least as early as the 6th century BCE. So in the 6th century, there was a class of people called the Homeridae, or sons of Homer. So they were active in Athens, and they participated in a festival there to recite the poems of Homer. They recited the Iliad and the Odyssey. So their function was to serve as people who preserved the work of Homer and who recited his work. So as far back as when they were active, which was the 6th century BCE, we know that these poems were attributed to Homer. And again, this doesn't seem to have been in doubt at all. We also see evidence of this from the Homeric hymns. So the Homeric hymns are poems which are shorter than the Odyssey and the Iliad, but they were attributed to Homer. But they were written long after the Odyssey and the Iliad. They date from towards the end of the 7th century or beginning of the 6th century through to around the end of that century or beginning of the 5th. So these poems are attributed to Homer, but we know they weren't actually written by him. But what's interesting is that one of them, the Homeric hymn to Apollo, this refers to a certain blind poet from Chios who would go on to compose songs that would be greater than any others in the whole world. So this is clearly a reference to Homer, who was said to have come from Chios and said to have been blind, and who was said to have composed the most famed poems of all time, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is clearly a reference to Homer as the author or composer of these works. So what we can see from this is that the evidence for these poems being attributed to Homer goes back a long way. It goes back about as far as the sources go that talk about the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So it's as firm a tradition as we can reasonably expect to have, and it also isn't conflicted by any opposing tradition about the author of these poems, and it seems to have been perfectly accepted by the ancient Greeks. So why doubt it? Now you might be thinking, modern scholarship has demonstrated that the Iliad and the Odyssey weren't composed in one go by a single poet, but that they were developed over centuries of oral tradition, with poet after poet adding on to what the previous generations had done. That's a very popular view, but that's not what Homeric scholarship holds today, and it hasn't done for a long time. Actually, what scholars generally believe today is that the Iliad was composed by a single mind. There's certainly no evidence that it was developed gradually over many generations of poets. The unity within the poem argues completely against that, and the same applies to the Odyssey. Now, there is disagreement about whether the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed by the same single mind, but they could have been. So we can see that the evidence from the poems themselves are consistent with the idea that they were composed by Homer. So where does this doubt come from? And especially, where does this idea come from that we can identify some other individual as the true author of the Iliad? Well, I first came across this theory in the work of Hans van Wees. Now, Hans van Wees is an excellent Homeric scholar. I love his work, I use it regularly, but in this particular regard, I think that he has come to some seriously flawed conclusions. So, let's dive in. What's his theory? Well, his theory is built around the fact that according to the evidence from the poems themselves, it's clear that they were composed in the 7th century. So when we look at, for example, the descriptions of armor and warfare, the descriptions of the weapons, the descriptions of the society at the time, the political background and geography of the poems, it's clear that they are set in the 7th century BCE, between about 700 and 650. That's when Hans van Wees pins down the descriptions in the poems, particularly from the point of view of warfare, but also in the world in general. Now, I realize this may contradict a lot of what you've heard before from YouTube videos or online, but it is very much mainstream Homeric scholarship today. So the issue is that Homer, according to lots of ancient historians, lived long before the 7th century BCE. So the problem is that if Homer lived before the 7th century BCE, and yet the poems attributed to him were clearly composed in that century, then he cannot have been their composer. So, for example, Herodotus tells us that Homer lived about 400 years before his time. Since Herodotus was writing in the middle of the 5th century BCE, that would place Homer in the middle of the 9th century BCE, so long before the 7th century. And many other later writers placed him even earlier, like Eratosthenes, for example. He placed Homer just 100 years after the Trojan War. He placed him in the 11th century BCE. So, based on this general consensus that Homer lived long before the 7th century BCE, combined with the clear evidence that it was in that century that these poems were composed, then it's clear that he cannot have been the actual composer of these poems. That is Hans van Wees' logic. He actually says something really interesting regarding this. He says, "The chief reason why scholars have been prepared to overlook such surely obvious objections, that is, objections to a date earlier than the 7th century, is, as suggested, that these arguments support the earliest possible date, and only the earliest possible date can rescue the ancient belief that the epics had been created by Homer." So the basic argument of Hans van Wees here is that since the poems date to the 7th century BCE, and Homer, by all accounts, lived earlier than that, then he cannot have been their true composer. That's his basic argument. So then, of course, we're left with the question, who really did compose them? Now, if you remember, I mentioned that the Homeric hymns are attributed to Homer, even though we know for sure that they were not written by him. So that clearly opens up the possibility that maybe the more famous poems attributed to him, as in the Iliad and the Odyssey, are just other examples of the same thing, basically other Homeric hymns, as it were. They're just other poems that were attributed to Homer by followers of him, and not actually written or composed by Homer himself. According to Hans van Wees, the most likely candidate for the true author of the Iliad and the Odyssey is a certain poet called Terpander. So he's known to have lived in the 7th century, and he's particularly associated with Homer's poems. He's said to have imitated Homer's style. He's particularly famous for reciting Homer's poems more than anything else. And just like Homer, he's famous for his contributions to the poetic traditions of ancient Greece. He was a very prominent, very famous poet in the 7th century. So he does seem like a good candidate for the true composer of these poems. Since he was particularly famous for reciting the Iliad and the Odyssey, perhaps he was the one who actually composed them, since they date to the very century in which he lived. So that's Hans van Wees' logic, basically. However, for a number of reasons, which I'll tell you now, I don't think that this argument stands up to scrutiny, and I think it is far more likely that Homer really was the true composer of these poems. So, for one thing, it's not true that all sources placed Homer so far back in time. One source worth mentioning is Theopompus. He lived in the 4th century BCE, so he post-dated Herodotus, that's true, but only by 100 years, and he predates Eratosthenes. And another source, which also predates Eratosthenes, is Euphorion. He also placed Homer in that same time, in the 7th century BCE. So we can see that there is a legitimate basis among the ancient records to place Homer in that century. There wasn't a universal agreement that he lived much further back in the past than that. And when we take that source which predates Euphorion and Theopompus, which is Herodotus, and his statement that Homer lived 400 years before his time, when we examine that more closely, we see that it's not really as strong a piece of evidence as it first seems. Because Herodotus doesn't actually say that Homer lived 400 years before his time. What he actually says is that he supposes that he didn't live any more than 400 years before his time. So that's his suggestion for an upper limit for when Homer lived. That's not when he's saying he thinks he actually lived. He's just saying he didn't live any further back than 400 years ago. So what's the basis for that? Well, we don't know. Herodotus didn't give us any more information. He didn't say why he thought he didn't live any earlier than 400 years ago. But what we do know is that sometimes ancient Greek historians used generation counting to estimate dates. And we know that Herodotus considered an average generation to be about 33 years, or 3 years to a century. So if he was giving an upper limit for when he believed Homer lived, surely he wouldn't use what he considered to be an average generation length, because that wouldn't be an upper limit. That would be a normal, reasonable estimate. An upper limit would surely involve a longer than expected or longer than average generation length. So for example, if he used a generation length of 40 years, then 10 generations would produce 400 years. So maybe that's how Herodotus calculated that Homer lived no more than 400 years before his time. Maybe he had a tradition that he lived 10 generations before him, so he used an upper limit of 40 years per generation to produce the upper limit of 400 years for Homer's career. We don't know exactly, but that's certainly a possibility. The point is, since we don't know how Herodotus arrived at this upper limit, and the fact it's clearly expressed as an upper limit, not when he believed he actually lived, then we clearly can't use this to contradict the other early evidence from Theopompus and Euphorion that Homer lived in the 7th century. And it's not just Theopompus and Euphorion who placed Homer in that century, although they are the earliest ones that I am aware of. But there were other ancient sources too that also placed him at that time. For example, Demetrius of Magnesia placed him in the time of Thaletus. So that again would indicate he lived in the 7th century, because that's when Thaletus lived. And then there's also the tradition that Homer was a contemporary and friend of the grandfather of the teacher of Pythagoras. Now, since Pythagoras was born in 570, then any friend of the grandfather of Pythagoras' teacher would logically be a figure from probably the first half, or maybe any part really, of the 7th century BCE, but not earlier than that. So this all shows that there is plenty of ancient evidence that places Homer in the 7th century BC, even though there are also plenty of sources that place him earlier than that. But since there are also many demonstrable examples of ancient sources exaggerating the antiquity of events and people significantly, then this shouldn't come as a surprise. Now, it's true that there are some ancient poems which are attributed to Homer, even though we can be certain that they weren't written by him, like the Homeric hymns, like the Homeric hymn to Apollo. That one claims to be composed by Homer, by the blind poet that it mentions, and yet it dates to the 6th century. So that clearly wasn't written by Homer, even though it's presented as such. That's true. However, the reason why we know that, in part, is because ancient sources tell us so. Ancient sources also give an alternative attribution for this Homeric hymn to Apollo. Yet there is no conflicting tradition with the attribution of the Iliad and the Odyssey to Homer. There is no tradition that they were composed by anyone else. Another key issue is the fact that if you take away the Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer, then you have taken away the fundamental thing which made Homer so famous. So the class of poets called the Sons of Homer, who existed to preserve the work of Homer and to preserve his legacy and to recite his poems and all that, their very existence is founded on the fact that he was a famous poet. If he didn't really compose any famous poems, then why did people want to imitate him? Why did people want to attribute these other poems to Homer? Why are there all these Homeric hymns? It wouldn't make any sense. If you take away the Iliad and the Odyssey, you have fundamentally undermined the entire reason for existence for this class of poets. Or are we to believe that he was a really famous poet, considered to be the most famous, most magnificent poet of ancient Greece, and yet none of his works have survived, despite the fact that there was this class of poets dedicated to preserving his work, and yet none of his works have actually survived? That's inconceivable, to me at least. I think that it is far more difficult to maintain that viewpoint than the viewpoint that he really did compose these famous poems, these magnificent poems, and because of that, there was this class of poets who wanted to continue preserving his work and his legacy. That makes sense. But the idea that actually the Iliad and the Odyssey were just written by someone who was just trying to imitate Homer doesn't make sense, because then you've taken away the entire reason to want to imitate Homer. So to me, I don't think that Hans van Wee's argument stands up to scrutiny here. There's also an interesting thing that he says about another suggestion which he counters, which I think also applies to his own suggestion. He mentions the theory that a certain Sinethus may have been the true composer of the Iliad and the Odyssey, with a certain Onomacritus as his scribe, and these figures lived in the 6th century in Athens. So there's this idea, and he points out that given that our sources seem to know quite a bit about both these figures, it is odd that there is never any mention of their role in publishing Homer, which would surely have been their greatest claim to fame. Now, the problem I have with this is that this exact same logic can be used against the idea that Terpander was the true composer of Homer's poems, because after all, we have a lot of information about Terpander. He's mentioned in a variety of sources. There's loads of information about him, just like these two figures from Athens, and yet there's no tradition that he was the true composer of the Iliad or the Odyssey. The closest thing we come to is the fact that he's said to have recited Homer's poems, but they are never attributed to him. They are always Homer's poems, never Terpander's poems. So to me, this exact same line of reasoning that Hans van Wees uses against this 6th century Athens theory can also be used against the 7th century Terpander theory. So to me, the far more coherent and logical explanation is simply that Homer really was the composer of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Any explanation which tries to attribute them to someone else just causes more problems than it solves. Now, if you'd like to hear about a fascinating new discovery, a new bit of research about the question of whether or not the Britons were really Celts, then come back next time for my next video.